how to make a major scale. So the rule here is you plug a note into the major scale pattern we just looked at. When you see a whole step, you count up 2 semitones after the note you are on. And when you see a half step, you count up 1 semitone after the note you are on. So if the note is a C, for example, you wouldn't count C and then progress to your next note. You would start counting your 1 from the note that comes after the C. In that case, it would be a C sharp. So let's look at that. For example, C, I start counting after C, and I go up a whole step on the chromatic scale. So I'm just going to have a shortened version of the chromatic scale right here, and it's going to show you, if you're looking at your notes on a chromatic scale, and you're starting from C, your C is going to be your 0. Your C sharp is going to be your 1, and your D is going to be your 2. So if I want to count up a whole step from C, I need to start counting from C sharp and then to D. And that's how you count up chromatically. I go over this a lot more in depth in my last Music Monday episode 4. So a whole step, or in other words 2 semitones, gives us the note D from C. So we're starting to make the major scale here, and that was our first step. We went from C and now we're at D. So the first 2 notes in our C major scale are C and D. Next, from D, we go up another whole step. So you go to D, and a whole step, remember, you're going to start counting after. So we're going to start on D sharp, 1, and then we're going to go to E, 2. So E is the 3rd note in the C major scale. So right now we have C, D, and E. Okay, so now that the whole step gave us the note E, when we look at our next step in the major scale pattern, we have a half step. So let's look at that. So we just did a whole step from C, which took us to D. Then we did a whole step from D, which took us to E. And now we're at E, and we're looking at a half step. So as you can see, all that I'm doing is going from E to F, and because of that, I don't count the first note, I start on the next note, so I only have 1 step. This is known as the half step. So I'm about to go over that more in depth. I just kind of wanted to explain the nature of a whole step and a half step a little more. But to conclude what was going on there, you plug any note into this pattern, and you get that note's major scale. So let's look at that again. We have our note C, and we have the major scale pattern down here. And as you can see, I drew it in the middle of each of these notes. And the reason is because when I'm going from C to D, I'm going to be using a whole step. So it makes sense visually if I put it here. Because then from D to E, you see I have that whole step. E to F, I have that half step. So when you look in the middle of what's bringing you from one note to the next note, and it tells you. And then up here I have what is known as each scale degree of C major, which would just be going up C major, up those 7 notes, and putting a number on each one of them. So here again is that chromatic scale, and we have those 12 notes, and each one of those is a semitone distance from the other one. And even though if you look at these 2 notes, there is not a black note in the middle of it. The black notes are your sharp notes. So when I go from B to C, there is no sharp in the middle of that, but it's still 1 semitone to the next semitone. So B to C is still 1 semitone. C to C sharp is also 1 semitone, but it's just going to a sharpened note. So basically when you're going up just 1 step in the chromatic scale, you're going up a semitone. So every time that I'm going up each one of these notes, that's just 1 semitone. So we're going to look at that again. I have my note C, and we're going to plug that into the major scale pattern. So that's going to give us C major. So look at the note C, and this is telling me a whole step. So we just did that, but let's look at it again. I'm going to go from C, and I'm going to start counting on the next step. So when you have memorized that there's no B and E sharp, you can do this in your head. But for now, I'm going to show you visually because I think it's a really good way to learn when you can actually look at this stuff and not try to make it too much of a confusion for your brain when you're still beginning. So we start on C, and as you can see here, it's already 1 and 2, so it kind of just clicks in your brain when you're looking at it. But I mean, furthermore, we're not going to have 1 and 2, so let's actually understand what's going on here. I'm going up those 2 steps, so I'm going from C, and I'm not counting that, and then I'm counting the note after that. So I'm counting C sharp, and then I'm counting D. And because I'm doing those 2 steps, now I have a whole step. And then from D, I'm going to go up another 2 steps after D. So I'm going to go to D sharp and then E. So now E, and you look at that, now I have that half step here. So that E is going to go up that half step, which is one semitone. So E is just going to take us directly to F because there is no E sharp. Furthermore, now that brings us to F, which has a whole step. You go up a whole step from F and you have 1, 2, we land on G. Okay, you go to G, whole step from there. We go 1, 2, we go to A, whole step, 1, 2, brings us to B, half step, we go up that one half step, which is also known as that one semitone, brings us to C. So as you can see, this brings us right back to the beginning again on that 12th semitone, which things can kind of get confusing with the numbers here, because up here I'm calling the scale degrees starting on C, but in the chromatic scale I'm starting on 0. So if this really is already starting to get confusing, I highly recommend looking at my interval video, because that really breaks down all this really well. So as you can see, at the end of any scale, you have a half step, and that's good to know. The ending of any scale has that half step that brings you back to the first note. This is very important in music. This is a little more advanced, so I wrote advanced up here. And that's that A sharp and B flat are enharmonic notes, which means those are different names for the same note. However, if you look at an A sharp and you plug that into the major scale, so you get an A sharp major scale, you're going to come out with a scale that has 4 sharps and 3 double sharps in its scale. And 3 double sharps meaning it's just 2 semitones above the note it's attributed to. So when you start to look at that, it's very confusing, and therefore it's not very ideal. So let's look at a C double sharp. I'm going to go to C, I'm going to go 2 semitones to C double sharp. That's the same note as D. So if you saw a C double sharp written down, you'd have to play a D. So that's where things would just get totally confusing. While if you look at a B flat major, remember A sharp and B flat are the same notes. But if you get B flat and you plug that into the major scale and you're using flats, then that whole scale only has 2 flats. And then the rest of the notes are just the natural notes, so they don't have any sharps or flats at all. These videos will be going over topics that are just using sharps, so that's more advanced, but it's good to know that. Okay, so next, something really good to know is that there are certain names that label each of the scale degrees that we have. The names attributed to the scale degrees are the same in major or minor. So as you look in major or minor, we have these same acronyms. I'm going to explain what those acronyms mean shortly, but the whole point is that in major or minor, you're going to have these same names. However, things start to get kind of weird because the functionality only really applies to the major scale and not so much in the minor scale, especially in its natural Aeolian form. Because of this, I will be focusing on the major scale here, so there's less confusion. Okay, so again, here's a little more of an advanced topic, so when you see that, I'm going to write advanced above it. In the minor scale's natural form, which is known as Aeolian, it is the 6th mode of the major scale, or in other words, the relative minor to the relative major. To find the relative minor, count up a major 6th from the major scale, note, or chord you're working with. This will give you the relative minor scale, note, or chord. However, the minor scale is often altered to have more of the functionality one would normally hear in a major scale, so it is typical to raise the 7th degree of the minor scale in order to create a leading tone, which then will also create dominant function with the 5th degree of the scale. I'm going to go over all this in a second. Below is the relative minor to the C major scale, which is A minor, and also the relative major scale to A minor, which is C major. So as you can see, when someone just says relative minor or relative major, those are branching off of each other. So the relative major is branching from the relative minor. This is the relative major of that relative minor. And when I look at a relative minor, okay, this is the relative minor to that relative major. It can go both ways. So in all major scales, in this case I'm looking at C major, the 7th degree of the major scale is a half step away from bringing us back to the 1 again. We can see this in the major scale pattern thought of in whole and half steps. So you just look at the major scale pattern I talked about in the beginning, and you look at the fact that the last step is that half step, which remember is very important. This is very important because this is that leading tone. So as you can see, the notes from 7 to 1 require a half step, in other words, from B to C. So it makes sense because B to C is a half step since B doesn't have a sharp. But if we look at the minor scale pattern in whole and half steps, the 7th degree is no longer a half step. It is a whole step. So look at the minor scale pattern here, and my last step is a whole step. So from 7 to 1, I have that whole step. And this makes sense because if I go from G to A, it's a whole step because G does have a sharp. So look at G, A, that wouldn't really be a leading tone from G to A because there's that G sharp in the middle. So in A minor, if we raise that G to G sharp, we now have a lead tone function as G sharp brings us right back to the tonic of A. So we go right from that G sharp right to A. Now we have lead tone function if we raise that G to G sharp in all the notes that we're going to be calling our A minor scale. Furthermore, when building a 7th chord from the 5th degree scale of the minor scale, now we have a dominant 7th built on the notes in the scale. So we have dominant function with that 5th scale degree using the diatonic notes in the scale that we're using. So I should also mention before moving on that raising the 7th degree of a minor scale is known as the harmonic minor scale. So let's look at that A minor scale now. And now we have those notes with just our G sharp being raised, so that'll take us right back to our A. So now if we build a 7th chord from that 5th degree, we're going to start on C here, and we're going to go up every other note, which is going to give us our chord. So we're going to have E, which brings us to G, which is our 3rd note, you see? And then we have B, and then we have D. So as you can see, there's our lead tone in that dominant chord. Another nature of a dominant chord is that since we made G, G sharp, now if we go from G sharp to D, which we do in our 7th, which makes it the dominant, we have a tritone. So now as you can see, we have that tritone from G sharp to D when we're making that 7th chord. This can also be looked at as a diminished triad from G sharp, B, and D. So whatever way you want to look at it, you have that tritone or that diminished triad going from your 3 to your 7 on your dominant chord. So let's look at another way to look at that dominant 7th chord. I would just be looking at its semitones. So we're looking at those 4 notes that make up the 7th chord. And as you can see, our first third has 4 semitones. So we have a major third. Our second has 3 semitones. And then the third to the 4th has 3 semitones. So if you look at this, we have a major third, a minor third, and another minor third. So as you can see, a major third with 2 minor thirds on top of it is the nature of a dominant 7th chord. An easier way to look at it might be looking at it as a major chord with an added minor third on top of that. However you want to perceive this, dominant function and lead tone function serve a very important role in music and can help you achieve the sound that you're looking for. So why does it work well when we change the minor scale to be more like a major scale? Some have theorized this is because the major scale has a closer relationship to the harmonic series than the minor scale does. The harmonic series is the natural preordained phenomenon that occurs in nature when a vibrating object sends out sine waves at a specific and stable frequency, which is often measured in hertz. For example, like when a guitar string is vibrating, it is sending those specific vibrations into the air. This specific vibration is known as a pitch, which we hear with our ears, and this means a note is just the matter of how many vibrations a second something is happening. So if we look at this note middle C is around 256 to 280 hertz, depending on how the person tuned it. Hertz is a measurement of cycles a second. So 256 to 280 just means that there's that many vibrations in a second, and when there are 256 to 200 vibrations of a second of something, the pitch of that is C. So you could literally take any noise and you could play it 280 times a second, and all of a sudden that noise would become middle C. Now this might make more sense when you think about vibrating something fast enough and a pitch comes out of it, like when you put a playing card in the spokes of a bike and it makes a sound like it has a gas-powered engine on it. That card constantly is tapping against each spoke, which then, after it starts hitting fast enough, creates a pitch, and you will notice that the faster you ride your bike, that the higher the pitch of that noise from the card will get. You are sending up notes. So a note and a pitch is just the phenomenon of how many times something is vibrating a second. But this is just the tip of the iceberg for the harmonic series.